welcome to Tu Bishvat in Mesopotamia. Now, today is actually Tu Bishvat, and Tu Bishvat is a very fun holiday which has a lot to do with trees and fruit and dried fruit and all kinds of fun stuff like that. What we're going to be doing today is talking about Tu Bishvat today, what Tu Bishvat used to be, and what people in the time of Avraham Avinu, like Avraham 3,800 years ago, did on Tu Bishvat, because believe it or not, they did, but it's not today's Tu Bishvat. It's a very different Tu Bishvat that has nothing to do with Judaism, but it still teaches us a lot about the Jewish calendar and all kinds of other interesting things. So we're going to learn about the Jewish year and the months and the holidays, and we're also going to talk about trees. We're going to talk about the biggest and tallest and oldest trees in the world, and we're going to see them. And then we'll have something interesting to think about, some food for thought. All right? So that's the plan for today. Let me just ask you, when you think about Tu Bishvat, I don't know what you do. Some people do things, some people don't do things. What do you think about, or what do you do when you hear Tu Bishvat, or you're on Tu Bishvat?
My family, we always buy a lot of new fruit from the store, and we try it.
Eat fruit.
Very nice. Eat fruit. Trees and passion fruit. Okay. So we're going to talk about all of those things. We're going to start with dried fruit, which is something that a lot of people eat. And there's a lot of reasons for eating fruit and dried fruit on Tu Bishvat. I'm going to give you the very historic kind of idea behind dried fruit, even though there's a lot more to this, so there's a lot more to learn. So why do people eat dried fruit? First of all, these are fresh figs. I have a fig tree right outside my house, and no figs are growing in the winter. So if you want to eat figs and Tu Bishvat, you're going to have dried figs. That's just how it is, unless you're bringing them from another country. Or, today we can do that, but it used to be that you couldn't. But there's also something really interesting about dried figs. So let's talk about dried fruit. Why did people eat dried fruit for so many thousands of years?
Because you couldn't just randomly get it from the store.
And
you couldn't store it in refrigerators.
So
good.
Basically
what I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a combination of two things, right? It's a combination of storage and also having it available at other times of the year. Now, there's another really interesting reason that I want to show you through a museum, actually the Israel Museum, and that has to do with the Canaanim, the Canaanites. In Canaan, about 4,000 years ago, in the time of Avram and before, and even later. So this is a section of the Israel Museum that deals with the Canaanim, who are merchants, and they also had ships. Now, we found a bunch of shipwrecks on the coast of Israel, and also lots of port cities where they have the things that were brought in from other countries, so we know what they had in their ships. So there's a reconstruction, a painting here of a ship of Canaanim who are unloading at the dock in ancient Canaan, ancient Israel at some point. And you see all the things that they had in the belly of the ship, or they're carrying out, and here's the actual things. We found them. So the picture is based on what we found. It's not the other way around, okay? So let's look at some of these things that were found in port cities and shipwrecks. On the left, we have these big, heavy stone things. What are these?
Anchors.
Very good. Yes, these are actually anchors. These are ancient anchors. The modern anchors require a steel manufacturer. They didn't have steel back then. They had bronze and some other stuff. They didn't make massive anchors. So stone made a lot of sense. It's very heavy. You weigh it down, and it keeps you more or less docked at shore. This little interesting thing, it looks like it's a stretched skin of an ox or an ox hide, which is why it's called an ox hide ingot, but it's actually a chunk of copper that came from an island called Copper Island, or in English, Cyprus. Kypros, it's actually Greek. So Cyprus is Copper Island, and they would take their ships to Cyprus, and they would bring all kinds of goodies to wherever they wanted to go. And then we have this little, if you've seen the movie WALL-E, this looks like Eva, the little floating robot, but this is actually a jug that in the ship, you notice that it's standing inside sand, which is kind of cool. So that way when the ship rocks, it doesn't crack, it doesn't fall over, it sort of moves. So they would stick it into the sand with its pointy bottom, it's just a good way to store them. And this one's cracked, and in the globe you see that there's a lot of dried figs. Dried figs from about 3,500 years ago. That's insane. Now, I wouldn't eat them. They're not edible, but the fact is that they would dry figs in ships. And here's the question. Why? What's the connection between dried fruit and ships?
Are the figs fossilized?
No, they're not fossilized exactly. They're just burnt and dried, kind of burnt. You can look at them really up close when you come to the museum. Hopefully you'll see them. You already have all the pieces. You just have to put it together. You already know the answer. You just have to put it together. Yeah. Zoe, you said it at first, but whichever.
So I'm thinking that maybe they use the figs like they dried out the figs so that they could keep it preserved, I guess, or they could like sell it.
Yep, exactly. Both. Also, Shlomo Menachem also wrote that. It's for transport, right? So you could transport fresh fruit, but 3, 4, 5 days and I mean, there are ways to preserve fruit, keeping it fresh for longer periods of time in very interesting ways that they still do in some very primitive parts of the world, like putting them in a certain kind of clay pot. But overall, drying fruit means it's not going to go bad, and you could bring it to the market in other countries. So the story of Tu Bishvat in Israel means that if people wanted to eat fruit, and specifically fruit from the land of Israel, on Tu Bishvat, they would have to dry it because it was shipped all over the world. So people wanted fruit or fruit at different times of the year. So that's really where it comes from. So if you have fresh fruit available, eat fresh fruit. You don't need to eat dried fruit. Now, there's a specific focus on the 7 species, Shiv'at HaMinim. Now, the 7 species, now I speak like an Israeli. Some people say Shivas HaMinim. I'm Israeli. So I'm just going to say the Hebrew and the English for those who are new. I try to keep the Hebrew on the screen so you'll be familiar, even if you're not so comfortable reading Hebrew, but it's there so you know what it looks like, but I always say it in English, okay? Sometimes I'll even read the Hebrew if we need to. So the 7 species of the land of Israel are a very interesting combination of fruits and grains, and I want to talk about why they are special. But first, just to mention that one of the customs on Tu Bishvat is to eat fruit that are specific to the land of Israel, whether they're actually from Israel and they would have them dried and shipped to wherever they were in Europe or, eating them, or local ones, but of those fruit. So it's Eretz Chita u'Seora, v'Gefen u'Te'ena v'Rimon, Eretz Zeit Shemen u'Dvash. So it's the land of wheat and barley, of vine, or that's grapes, figs, and pomegranates, the land of oil olives, which means olives, that we make oil from, and dvash is honey, which means date honey, not bee honey. Bee honey wasn't really a thing as much back then. When we call Israel the land of milk and honey, we mean goat milk and we mean date honey, right? We don't mean cow milk, and we don't mean oat milk, and we don't mean almond milk and all that fancy stuff, and we don't mean bee honey. We simply mean the land of milk, which is from goats, and honey, which is from dates. So what is unique about Shiv'at HaMinim, the 7 species, in all together? You really need to understand the topography and the geography of the land of Israel. So I'd like to zoom out for a moment to explain why Shiv'at HaMinim, why the 7 species are some of the blessing of the land of Israel in the Torah, the biblical blessing of the land of Israel. Because if you look at the entire region, some areas are more desert, some areas are more hills, some areas are more rivers. Israel has a little bit of everything. It has a little bit of the Alps, a little bit of the Nile, a little bit of not really, but it's kind of like a little bit of everything. We're in between Asia, Africa, and Europe. So in some countries, you have some of these species, but not the others. Like, for example, in Egypt, you have plenty of grain because you have the Nile. You have palm trees, but you don't have olives, and the grapes rarely grow here, and very little. If you go to Mesopotamia, you have plenty of dates, you have plenty of pomegranates, but you don't have olives and you don't have grapes. You also don't have you actually and you have grain, right? Now, if you go to Greece, for example, the Greeks are excellent at growing olives and they have great vines, but their wheat and barley doesn't grow so well in the mountains. You need plains, right? So Israel has everything. So that's one of the unique things about Israel. It's got the best of all these different worlds. Okay, so that's Shivat HaMinim. Now let's talk a little bit more about fruit. So first of all, dried fruit. Now, if you're in Israel and you go to the market around now, which is Tu Bishvat, but the weeks leading up, everybody's selling dried fruit. And if you go to work, someone in your office is going to give you a gift, a nice box of dried fruit and nuts. It's like it's a thing on Tu Bishvat. It's just a thing everywhere. Everybody's like, we're having a town hall. We're going to have some Tu Bishvat themed food, which we actually did have in my neighborhood this week. So it's a thing in Israel. You feel it wherever you go. But now let's talk about a Seder Tu Bishvat. So we have a Pesach Seder. Everybody knows what a Pesach Seder is. We set up the table nicely, special foods, we dress up, we have a Haggadah, we read, we sing songs, we tell stories, wonderful. What is a Tu Bishvat Seder? So I took pictures 11 years ago at this Tu Bishvat Seder in Brooklyn. The host, his name was Raymond Arking. He's a Syrian Jew. And he went to all of the big produce markets in New York, 5 or 6 of them, and bought a little bit of everything. And I mean everything. I was only able to capture so much with my old phone 11 years ago, but this is all his house, and there's tables that they just run all around every room of the house, and there is simply everything you can find in the market at the time. By the way, most of this is fresh. There's obviously things that are made into cake and all kinds of stuff. So there are bottles of drinks, like there's Maccabi beer, which is barley, there is pomegranate juice, there's fig arak, there's wine, and then there's, of course, whiskey. I don't think you could see it in one of these pictures, but there's whiskey as well. And then all these funky fruit. In the top left, you'll see that there's sugarcane and tamarindi, which looks like a carob, but it's actually like a sticky date, but it doesn't look like a date. But it tastes, once you crack it open, it looks like a date, but on the outside it doesn't. And then you have these like fluffy, they look like sea urchins. They're actually like lychees or lychees. They're just a different fluffy kind. And there's everything. And we sat and we sang and we read, and they actually have this thing that they read. It's called the Ten Commandments, but it's in Arabic. It's in Judeo-Arabic. So it's written in Hebrew, but it's Arabic, just like Jews from Europe speak Yiddish. So there's this Judeo-Arabic that Syrians read. So I was breaking my teeth trying to read it. They said, here, take, you're a guest, read it. I'm like, it was just funny. Anyway, we had a great time. And there's also a kind of a logic to the way in which you eat the fruit. So you start with the fruit from the land of Israel. Then there's things with seeds, with shells on the outside, nuts. There's like from softness to hardness. There's all kinds of interesting things that you do. And there's Kabbalistic things. This thing is about 300 to 400 years old. People never did it beforehand. And for the adults listening, there is a connection to Shabtai Tzvi, the guy who claimed that he's the Mashiach like 400 years ago. Like he also did this, but I'm not getting into that right now. It's just in case you were wondering, yes, there is a connection, but this is legitimate Jewish stuff. It's just like a Kabbalistic custom. It's a new thing. So that was for the adults who are paying attention to this. Don't overwhelm yourself. I'm not getting into Shabtai Tzvi now. In Israel, we have a festival of planting trees. A festival of planting trees on Tu Bishvat. Now, we have songs about this in Hebrew. Tu Bishvat higiya, chag la'ilanot. Like, why are we singing about a holiday for trees? Well, people go and they plant. Olchim hashotlim, na 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 na. Israelis grow up with songs about planting trees on Tu Bishvat and everything blossoming. This did not exist 200 years ago, not even 150 years ago, just a little bit under 150 years ago. This began as part of a Zionist movement of building the land of Israel. Let me ask you, have you ever seen this tzedakah box, this charity box, this pushka, the blue box of the JNF? Your grandparents' house must have it. This is like every Jewish home in the diaspora had something like this. Some of these are so old, they say 100 years to the JNF, to the cacao. The JNF is called the Jewish National Fund, and it was established to support the settling of the land of Israel, both in terms of buying land and also in terms of planting trees. It was basically a way for Jews around the world to support Israel, to support the land of Israel through buying land and through planting trees. So as part of the rebuilding of the land of Israel, just under 150 years ago, Jews began planting trees in Israel as a kind of supporting Israel. Because Israel was kind of like a barren place, and it started becoming green, and reviving forests is an amazing thing. So this was a way you could support Israel from wherever you live. Now, I have a family connection to the JNF because some of my family members, some of them have already passed away. We're talking about Holocaust survivors. They donated a lot of money to the JNF. We have a reservoir in the north of Israel named after my great uncle Jack from Atlanta, Jack Hirsch. And they donated a lot of forests for trees. So this plaque on the right is a photograph I took of a plaque in my parents' house. It says Trees for Israel and lots of trees on it. And it says, a garden of trees has been planted in honor of the marriage of Shoshana and Barnea Levi Sullivan by Gladys and Jack Hirsch, March 22nd, 1983, the 8th of Nisan, 5743, Atlanta, Georgia. These are my great aunt and uncle. So we actually visit this place. It's called the State of Alabama Forest. My great aunt, Gladys, while she lived in Atlanta, she was from Birmingham, Alabama. So this is the Alabama Forest in Israel with the logo of the JNF. And my mother and her first cousin are pointing at the names on the plaques that are their respective parents, or like my great, either my grandfather or my great uncle, or several of them. And that's me in the brown shirt in the picture. I know I look a little bit different without the facial hair, but that's me. So this is planting trees in Israel. And that dog is Pookie. He died at the age of 12, 11 years ago. So unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but we have fond memories of Pookie. Before we get to Mesopotamia, I'd like to talk about the Jewish year. Okay? I'd like to talk about the Jewish year. The Jewish year is very complicated, and that's why in many of our classes we talk about different parts. But this cycle over here is showing us the different months, their names that we use today, Tishrei, Marcheshvan, Kislev, and all the different holidays. And I'd like to focus on what is Tu Bishvat. So first of all, let's narrow it down to the three festivals, the Shalosh Regalim. The three festivals where there's a biblical requirement when the temple is standing for Jews to come and visit the temple in Jerusalem at least once a year. It's Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, right? So these are the very familiar ones. What is Tu Bishvat? Where does it fit? It actually doesn't. Tu Bishvat is a 2,000-year-old new year for tax purposes. What am I talking about? Let me explain. So there's a Mishnah here, which is it's about 1,800 years old. It's a very ancient Jewish source, and I'm not expecting you to now read this all. I'm actually going to break it down, but I want to show you that there's a Mishnah that it's a tractate that's called Rosh Hashanah, and it's all about Rosh Hashanah, the new year. But it opens up by saying there's actually 4 different dates throughout the year in which you begin counting the new year. It just depends what it is you're counting for. So I just placed each one, Tishrei, Elul, Shvat, and Nisan, where they're supposed to fit respectively on the cycle. But now let's actually go through them one by one, and we're going to learn what Tu Bishvat was originally. So it says as follows, Arba Rosh Hashanah, there are 4 different Rosh Hashanahs. On the 1st of Nisan, which is around April, basically Pesach, Rosh Hashanah lemelachim ve'largalim. It's the beginning of the year for kings and for the festivals. What does that mean? In the ancient world, and I'm talking about Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, and Israel, if a king would become king for whatever reason, his father died, something happened, he became king, any time in the middle of the year, that was called year 0. Year 1 begins whenever Nisan happens. So if you became a king 2 months before Nisan, that's year 0, or year 1. It doesn't really matter. There's different ways. But Nisan comes, that's the beginning of the following year. Why do we do that? Who cares when a king becomes king in the ancient world? Does anybody know why the years of kings matter in the ancient world?
That they how long they ruled for.
So that's an interesting thing for historians, right? But let's say for the man on the street, the man and woman on the street, why? Who cares? Why do they need to know? Let me ask you a simple question. What is today's date? Other than Tu Bishvat, because it is Tu Bishvat. What is today's date?
February something.
Well, yes, February 13th, right? And what's the year?
2025.
2025. Now, 2025 is a calendar which was
5785, really.
Yeah, 5785 is the Jewish calendar. 2025 is the Gregorian calendar that counts from the birth of Jesus. So that's like, wait a minute, why are we counting for that? Why is that? Why do we use that year? Because everybody uses it. So if you want to sign a document or, anything, you need to have a date. The dates in the ancient world were the years of the king. The dates in the ancient world were the years of the king. So if you find an ancient document from Babylon from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, it's going to say in the 13th of Adar, and yes, it will actually say Adar, and it will say year so-and-so of Nebuchadnezzar. And I've seen these. I've read them with my own eyes, like the ones in Aramaic from Elephantine, that says year, month of this, day this of that month, year this and that of King Artaxerxes, so of Persia. We'll talk about this in about a month when we have our third class about Persia. Okay, so yes, this is all stuff that's practical. And Regalim is the festival. So once a year you have to come to the temple in Jerusalem. Well, when do we begin counting the year? Nisan. On the first of Elul is Rosh Hashanah, is the first of the year for Ma'asar Behemah. For Ma'aser literally means a tenth. It's a tax. But this tax is a special tithe. It's a tax that's given to the priesthood, to the Kohanim and Levim. So I am a Kohen. I am a priest. Because the Kohanim and Levim were supported by the community because they didn't own land, so the community would support them by paying them taxes. So you would find the Kohen or Levi in your neighborhood, and you'd bring them wool from your sheep or an animal or vegetables or fruit or things like that. When do you begin counting how much you made each year? It depends what you're counting. If you're counting sheep, the first of Elul, which is around September, because that's when naturally in Israel sheep start giving birth. Today you pump them with hormones, so they give birth 3 times a year. Today it's a little bit more complicated. My wife used to give birth to sheep, like not like that, like she was a sheep doula, right across the street in the farm here. So she told me this. Okay, now what is Tu Bishvat? So on the first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah for years, which means when we count the Jewish year of 5785, that's when we switch the year. Shemitah and Yovel, so that's the 7-year cycle of the sabbatical year, which is agricultural. Yovel is the Jubilee, it's a 50-year cycle. Nitiyan Yerakot, so things that you plant that are like seasonal, vegetables. So you need a beginning of a year for those, that's them. The first of Shvat is Rosh Hashanah La'ilan. Is the new year for trees, which means the new fruit of that year begins in Shvat. That's according to the school of Shammai. Bet Hillel, the school of Hillel, who we follow, say it's the 15th. And Tetvav, 2 is simply the Hebrew representation for the number 15. Tu Bishvat means the 15th of Shvat. It's an argument that has to do with trees and the reality on the ground in Israel. Now, let's talk about Mesopotamia. Okay, this is where it's now going to get really interesting. Okay, so we had a lot of classes about Mesopotamia, but I want to make sure that all our newcomers know exactly what we're talking about. So Mesopotamia is this area that's on the screen. It is in what's called today southern Iraq, near Persia, near Kuwait, near the Persian Gulf, and it's the area that's between 2 rivers. The river here on the south is called Nahar Prat, the Euphrates, and the river to the north of it is called Nahar Chidekel, or the Tigris River. And the area which is in between them is called in Greek between the rivers, or Mesopotamia. So Meso means middle, like Mexico is Middle America. It's called Mesoamerica. So, or a mezzanine is that in between, you go down an elevator, like a mezzanine. It's an in between. So this area is called Mesopotamia. Now, the reason Mesopotamia is important is it's the cradle of civilization. It's where the first farmers began farming properly. The first cities were built, and agriculture began expanding and domestication of animals and mathematics and astronomy, building of cities. So we learned a lot about this. In Mesopotamia, there's two cities I'd like to focus on. One of them is one of the oldest cities in the world. It's called the city of Uruk. In the Torah, it's called Erech. And the second one is the city of Larsa, which in the Torah is called Elasar, which is in Parashat Lech Lecha. When Avraham is involved with a battle with a bunch of kings, we learn about the king of Elasar. His name is Arioch, right? So let's get into it. Okay. So here's the city of Uruk. Now, the city of Uruk today looks like a heap of mud, which you would not know is something important, but let's see what we can see with our own eyes when we start moving around the ruins of Uruk. If you start looking around, you might see clues to ancient bricks. See that? You're going to start seeing that there's something here. And then in the distance, there is this little mound, which looks a little less innocent than a mound. See if we can get a little closer. And you'll start seeing bricks everywhere, lots and lots of bricks. So that means the bricks crumbled, but these used to be buildings. And this used to be a tower. What is the Tower of Uruk? Let me show you. In ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the kingdom 4,000 years ago is called Shumer. Shumer, or Shinar in the Torah's language. Shumer was basically the where civilization began, and what you're looking at in the distance is this tower. This is what the city would have looked like when it was thriving and the rivers were running around it. So you see that at the center of the town, there's this temple. What is this temple called? It's a translation of Stairway to Heaven. It's called Ziggurat. Ziggurat means a stairway to heaven.
Was it a river that was already there, or did they make the river?
Both. So in ancient Mesopotamia, I'll look at the picture. First of all, there were a lot of rivers everywhere, and the ancient Sumerians would dig canals. And the kings of Sumer had a responsibility to maintain the canals because there were always flash floods and mud and stuff gets stuck and then you don't get water. So maintaining the canals was a very big deal, but they dug canals and there were also natural canals. There was rivers everywhere. Just sometimes they dry up, they're moved, they're relocated. There's a dam built somewhere. So let's jump from here to the next city, the city of Larsa, or Elasar, which was a very vibrant city in the time of Avraham, 3,800 years ago, and that's where we are now traveling to. We're going to find out what they did in their temple. So let's look up close, and you see that there's a bit of an outline of what must have been a temple or some old buildings. They also found a ziggurat here. We know of about 40 of them. So all of the ancient cities at this time in Shumer had a massive temple somewhere in the center of the city, and there's water around it. So they all looked very similar, but each one was a little bit different. So the picture that I showed you is actually the city of Ur, where Avraham was born. That's further down. And we covered this in earlier classes, so I'm not going over it again now, but you can ask me later about which ones, and I'm happy to refer you. Okay, now, we've done digs in Elasar, in Larsa, and we actually found remains of documents that told us that they had a Tu Bishvat celebration that was 8 days long. On the 15th of Shabbatu, that's how they said Shvat, Shabbatu. On the 15th of Shvat, they had an 8-day festival, which is really interesting because all of our 7 or 8 day festivals are on the 15th of the month. We'll focus on that in a little bit. We'll think about that in a little bit, okay? So, again, Larsa, Elasar is mentioned in the Torah. I put the quote here below just so you can see that I'm not making it up. It says, Arioch Melech Elasar. On Tu Bishvat, the priests, the Kohanim of the city of Larsa, would go to the top of the temple, set up a table, put food up there as kind of like a gift for their gods, and they would sing songs. And they were also a bit of astronomers because the ancients believed that the stars are gods and goddesses, so they worshipped the stars. That's why in Hebrew, idolatry is also called Avodat Kochavim, which means serving the stars. or mazalot, which means the zodiac. So that's all related to ancient mythologies and idolatry. So they would look into the sky and they would look for the planet Venus, which you could usually see at the middle of the month if you're in the right place in the world in the right season. So they would look for the star Venus. Now, before we talk about why Venus and what did they call Venus, because they did not call it after the Greek and Roman goddess, what happens in the sky in every 15th of the month? What do you see if you just look up into the sky?
A full moon.
A full moon. That is correct. Now, it's important to understand that this is not a coincidence, because the whole idea of a month is the cycle of the moon. That's where the word month comes from. It's a moonith. So you can always know exactly what day of the month it is based on the moon, even if without being an expert astronomer. The middle of the month is very easy. It's just a full moon. Okay, so the 15th of the month, by the way, we have two Jewish holidays that are on the 15th of the month and that they last for 7 or 8 days, right? Which ones am I talking about?
15th of Tishrei.
Yes, the 15th of Tishrei is Sukkot. And what's the other one?
15th of Pesach.
That's right. The 15th of Nisan is Pesach. Now, Shavuot doesn't have a date because Shavuot is like the 8th day of Pesach, except instead of being on the 8th day, it's on the end of 7 times 7 weeks. So it has the same name as the 8th day of Sukkot. It's Shmini Atzeret. Shavuot is called Atzeret. So just so you know, there's a parallel. In other words, we really only have 2 festivals. Just one of them is connected to the first. Okay, so Shavuot is connected to Pesach. That being said, the Sumerians had a festival on the 15th of Shvat, in which they would have an 8-day festival. On each of the 7 days, they would serve a different god or goddess in their mythology. And on the 8th day, they would celebrate their king, who is considered to be like a king who was ruling because the gods let him rule. So it was basically serving their gods, and then the 8th day was for their king. That's what they did. Now, regardless of that, they would look into the sky and look at the planet Venus. Why? Why? Who cares about the planet Venus? So I want you to think about what Venus would be for them. Okay, this is the symbol for Venus, which is also the symbol for female, because Venus is the female goddess of beauty, who's also known as Aphrodite, which is the Greek and Roman names for the same character. In Hebrew, the planet's called Noga, which means glow. It's glowing. And in Sumerian, it was called Ninsiana. Ninsiana. Ninsiana is, in their mythology, is the daughter of the moon god named Sin. The moon god is Sin. The sun god is Shamash. So it sounds like the Hebrew Shemesh. Why would they need to know if you can see Venus or not? So listen carefully and tell me if this reminds you of anything in the Jewish calendar. If they would see the planet Venus, they would know, based on their calculations, that the winter is drawing towards an end, and they wouldn't have to do anything. But if they would not be able to see Venus on the 15th of Shvat, then they would know that it's going to be a very long winter. They're only going to see it next month, so they would add a 13th month, which is a second Adar. So we would have Shvat Adar, they would have another Adar, and then Nisan would be in the spring, as opposed to Nisan showing up in the winter.
It kind of sounds like Groundhog Day.
Like what? Groundhog Day? Ha! Yeah,
Yeah.
instead of seeing the groundhog, you see the moon. Okay, that's very cute. It's also in February, so yeah, Leroy was saying that it's kind of like Groundhog Day, which is kind of accurate. So, but this is really interesting because it's similar to the Jewish calendar, where we add a second Adar because we don't want Nisan, the spring festival, to be in the rain and in the mud. So you'd have to add a month. That's why we added it. So this is what the ancient Mesopotamians did in the time of Avram on Tu Bishvat, which is really cool. But okay, let's now talk about the Jewish year. So we're going to talk about the months for a little bit, and we're going to learn something really fascinating, and then we're going to talk about trees. And we're going to see the oldest, tallest, and biggest trees in the world, and then a little surprise that comes from Israel. Okay, so in the Torah, the months don't have names. They just have numbers. just numbers. So they're written like this. HaChodesh HaRishon means the first. Sheni, Shlishi, Revi, Chamishi. It's just numbers. I made 3 different colors for Nisan, the first month, for Marcheshvan, Cheshvan, the 8th, and the 11th, which is now, which is Shvat, and you'll see why in a moment. Okay? Now, we now use these months, which I'm writing them in Hebrew. I'm going to switch them to English in a moment. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, all of these, okay? Where do these months come from? Why do we use them? Does anybody know why we use them?
Babylon?
Babylon, that is correct. Now, Babylon happens to be in Mesopotamia. So these are Babylonian months that we as Jews adopted in Galut, in exile, just like today. If I'm to ask you when is your birthday, most of you might say, October, September, November, February. You're going to use the English date because that's what everybody uses. So that's what everybody used in Babylon. We adopted them. We brought them back to Israel. And then we later started giving them meaning. And I want to give you an example of one of them. Month number 8 is called Marcheshvan, or if we shorten it, it's Cheshvan. Why is it called Marcheshvan? Does anybody know why it's called Marcheshvan? I'm curious if you know the popular answer to that. Mar in Hebrew means bitter.
Because of the flood.
Because of the flood? Oh, because the flood, well, in the story of Noach, the flood is on Cheshvan. That's very nice. I like that. But the truth is that it's because of what the word means in Sumerian. Okay? So let me show you. Okay. So we discussed is that on Tu Bishvat, on the 15th of Shvat, the Sumerians would decide whether or not to add a second Adar, just like we do, except we don't do it on Tu Bishvat. We do it based on calculations, and you have up till Adar to do it. Once Adar is over, you can't say, okay, let's retroactively transform Nisan into the second Adar. You can't do it. When it's over, it's over. Okay? Now, let's look at the Hebrew months. Look how Marcheshvan is written. Remember that in Hebrew there's another word for month, which is moon. So in addition to the Sumerian similarity of adding a second Adar, the word Marcheshvan actually means 8th month. Yareach Shman. Marach Shman, Yerach Shman. Marcheshvan. The sounds get a little bit jumbled up over thousands of years, but month number 8, moon number 8, simply means Marcheshvan. That's what the month just means, month number 8. That's what Marcheshvan means. Isn't that cool? So people say it's bitter because there's no holidays on Cheshvan, and all the other holidays, or all the other months more or less have at least something festive, which is not exactly true, but sort of, kind of. Anyway, that was that. So we learned where the months come from. We learned about the 8th month. We learned about the moon. We learned about Sumer, and also fruit, dried fruit, the 7 species, and planting trees. Now let's talk about trees. I'd like to end with some really fun stuff about trees and food for thought. And we're going to visit some of these. There's a saying in the Torah, Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh. It says, for human is the tree of the field. Now, the truth is that this saying is a little bit of a sleight of hand. In other words, it doesn't actually mean what you think it means. We usually read it like this. I want to tell you what the whole story is. And in the back of your mind, I'd like you to think of similarities between trees and humans. And I'm going to ask you for similarities between trees and humans. So think about that. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to tell you the following context. I'm posting the Hebrew, but I'm going to say it in English. It's in Parashat Ki Tetzeh. It's in the story about waging war against another city. And it says, if you are laying a siege on another city for a very long time, do not damage its trees. Do not lift an axe on the trees, because those trees feed you. You may not cut them down, because is the tree a person that you're laying siege on it? It's a rhetorical statement. It's a rhetorical question. Is the tree a person? Now you can read that the tree is a person, but it's clearly a rhetorical question. It basically means leave the trees alone. Down, down. Okay? So the only trees you can touch are trees who you know do not bear fruit. Those you could chop down and turn into siege towers and pickets and whatever you need until you are able to have a victory against the city. That's the context. But now the Jewish sages, Chazal, took this and played around with it and said, let's just isolate it and talk about a comparison of humans to trees. Now you've had time to think about it, I hope. What are some similarities between humans and trees? Feel free to open your mic. Just make sure if somebody's speaking, just wait your turn, okay? Similarities between humans and trees.
They bear fruit.
We
They bear
both bear
kids.
we both bear fruit, and we actually call our children fruit, like fruit of the womb, right? Okay, yes. Very good. Yes, Shlomo and Menachem.
Trees grow and humans grow.
Right, we both grow. Very good. Let it grow, let
I
it
have another
grow.
question. Are you talking about humans spiritually or like?
Yes. First of all, you got so excited that you moved away, but yes, I'm also talking spiritually.
Basically, we grow fruits. The fruits are mitzvahs.
So yeah, we produce good deeds and things, and that is what we create, right? We have a positive output into the world, basically. Right. So that's a very good connection. Think of other connections as well, like having wisdom is like having branches, right? Having a foundation, a strong family, strong roots means you don't easily lose your way. You are rooted, right? We talk like that. We talk about humans as if they are trees, and we make these kinds of connections. Yes, Menachem, yes. And Nechama, I don't know who's pointing at who and what you're trying to say, but
Aren't the roots like tied up? Like
roots go
you're
down. Yes.
connected, and you're connected to the Torah, so the roots are like tied
Yes,
up.
yes. So the roots means deep connections, right? So we use that language of trees. Now here's another really, really interesting one. Rafa, did you want to add something?
And another version is like our hairs on our body and our hair on our head is like the leaves on the tree, you know?
Yeah. We have our hands branch out and we're like, very good. Yeah. So there's a lot of these really interesting connections. And I want to share with you a couple of other ones. One of them has to do with how long we live. Relative to most of the animal kingdom, we live very long. Not the longest. There are parrots and tortoises that live for longer, but we live very long. The trees are some of the oldest organisms in the world. We are two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of the animals, the animal kingdom. We are the kings of the animal kingdom. We're the most sophisticated, right? And then there's trees, which are the kings of the forest. There's no question about that, right? And the other thing is storytelling. Humans have history. We tell stories and we carry the story on for future generations. Trees have an interesting way of doing that. How? I would like to show you. So let's do a quick overview. The oldest, tallest, biggest trees in the world. Who is the tallest tree in the world? It has a name. Does anybody know what the tallest trees in the world are or where they are, where they're in the world?
Cypress trees.
Much taller than cypress trees.
Redwood.
Very good. Redwood. That's one of them. Anybody know any other details about them? Names, anything? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
They're very thick.
Biggest trees in the world are indeed redwoods. Yes, Rafa.
Sycamores.
So, these are bigger than sycamores, much bigger. But yeah, let me show you how big redwoods can be. They can be as tall as the Statue of Liberty, which is about 380 feet, or as long as 3 blue whales. These are called redwoods and sequoia trees. So I'd like to take you to where they grow. They grow in California. All of the largest and oldest trees in the world that we know, with a few caveats to that, are in the West Coast, California, Nevada, Utah, this area. This is the redwood forest, okay? Now I'm going to give you a website that tells you where all of them are with the top of every category, which is a lot of fun. But this is Redwood National Park. So there's a whole trail here. There's a lot of different trails. I'm going to show you a couple of them. So somewhere around here is a tree called hairy coal. I don't know which one it is, but I'll tell you how you can find out. Look, there's a trail that was cut through a fallen tree. Now, a 350-foot tall tree that falls down is dangerous. So every once in a while, when you see a tree's going to fall, the Nature and Parks Reserves actually have to come in and chop it down in a controlled way so that it doesn't destroy the forest. Now, this tree used to be the second tallest tree in the world until very recently. It actually has a plaque below here that tells you when, like 1990s. Its name is hairy coal. It has a name. Trees are given names when they're that old. Look at that. It's just very tall. I'll show you how tall it is. Okay? And there's a plaque here that tells you second tallest tree. Height at 1964 was 367.4 feet. The tallest trees in the world today are several dozen feet taller. But this was the second tallest tree in the world in the 1990s. Okay? So, that was the first one. Before I tell you what's the tallest, we're going to go to the Sequoia National Forest, which is not far from here. It's also in California. Look at this place. It's full of trees. Now, it's not easy to find the tallest tree because you can't just look at the height. You have to look at the altitude. You have to look at its elevation because it's not flat. Yeah, it's not flat. So let's take you to the entrance to the visitor center, the Giant Forest Museum, and these are sequoias or redwoods because they're red. Yes, Leora.
Are the trees okay with the California fires and everything?
Yeah, they're not in the Palisades. Yeah, thank God. This tree is called Sentinel, which means like a guardian, so it has a name. Look how tall this is. This is insane, right? Now, let me show you another one. This is one of the tallest trees in the world, but it's actually the biggest tree in the world. So the biggest also has to do with the width and the height. It's a combination. Its name is General Sherman. That's what the tree is called. So I asked who is the largest tree in the world, who is the tallest. That's because we give them names, because they're that unique. They stand out. So like people have names, trees have names. Okay? So this is one. Now, before we go on to the oldest trees in the world, I'd like to summarize who are the tallest trees in the world. Second, who's calling me? I can't answer right now. Okay, so I want to show you my secret weapon and how I actually know all of these different trees. There's a website called famousredwoods.com, and it has everything. So look, if you go down to any of the trees, like for example, here's hairy coal, we just saw this, and you go down below, it says directory, champions, rankings, disclaimer, it's got everything. So if you go here, it says, okay, the redwood rankings, tallest coast redwoods, largest coast redwoods, largest giant redwoods. So you have all of these, and you can click on them, and it will tell you all about them. Okay, now here's the champions. The champions, the largest, the tallest, the widest, largest horizontal axis, deepest, this, largest, there's all these different categories. I chose the first three, largest, tallest, and wildest. There's their names. The largest is actually General Sherman. It's in the giant redwood, as opposed to the coast redwood, which is called Hailstorm. It's 44,753, whatever. I'm not getting into the math, but General Sherman is larger. The tallest is called Hyperion, and the widest is called General Grant. So let's go to that. I see that there's questions, but the largest tree award, well, the largest is General Sherman. The tallest is Hyperion. It's 380 feet. That's taller than the Statue of Liberty, that's for sure, and the giant pyramids. The thickest tree is called Jupiter. That's the thickest tree. So these are quite impressive trees. Okay? Yes, Leora. I just see we're over time, and with all these interruptions, I don't want to drag it out. But
Do redwoods grow outside of California?
yes, the Chinese actually brought some to China.
That is awesome.
Yeah, but they're obviously not, they haven't been there for hundreds of years yet, so they're not going to be that big. These trees are hundreds of years old. Yeah. Some of them are more than hundreds of years old. So that brings us to our next question, which is the oldest trees alive today. And I have a really cool surprise for you. The oldest trees alive today are in Nevada. Let me take you there. And there's a whole park here that's full of pine trees. Now, this is a gigantic park. There are millions of trees here. So good luck finding them, right? Like there's some trees that their location is kept secret. And it's called Wheeler Peak, Nevada. And the oldest tree alive here that's known today, his name is Methuselah or Methuselah, the oldest man in the Torah, Methuselah. So that's what you called somebody very old. He's Methuselah. So he was somewhere here. And there was an older one, but it died already. It's called Prometheus. So I just want you to see all these different trees, but this is a very gigantic area. Let's move in a little bit more. So one of the oldest trees, it's actually older than the oldest one alive here today, but it was cut down. At least that's what we thought until recently, and I'll explain what I mean. Somewhere here, we found Prometheus, but he was cut down about 100 and something years ago. And where is he today? He's in the visitor center at the beginning of the park. So here's the visitor center. There's all these pine trees. And you go in here. Couldn't find the inn, but I have a picture, so that should work. Now, I have a question really quickly. How do we know how old a tree is?
By its rings.
Tree rings. Every year, a tree adds a ring. Now, some rings are very thin, some are very thick. Each one is also different based on the kind of tree it is, the kind of climate, environment. So the rings really are the way to know how old a tree is. And this picture shows you how you can date a tree without killing it. So you have a special drill that basically pulls out a core, a sample. It's like taking a biopsy. The doctor takes a needle and pokes you and it hurts, but he pulls out something, they take it to the lab. So you can see the tree rings, and then you can study the rings of the tree and you can count them. So there's a really interesting field of study, which is called the study of the inside of trees, or dendrochronology. And I want to tell you how trees tell stories. So hold on, because there's some really fun surprises here before we wrap up. Okay, in a few minutes we should be finished. And then we'll have some other questions, okay? Otherwise, write them in the chat, and I do look at the chat, okay? So what you see here is a picture of 4 different trees that are put together like a puzzle piece that can trace backwards the history of a forest, because all the trees grew in the same forest. So for example, there's the tree all the way on the right, and there's a timeline here. Okay, so let me explain it like this. So this tree was cut down. This is just the rings. The tree was cut down, let's say in the year 2000, so you count the rings backwards. This tree is 100 years old. It was planted in 1900. Now here's a tree that was cut down in 1920, and you count the rings, and it goes back to 1840. Now, what's important here is that they have a 20-year overlap, and they have the exact same ring. Every year for each forest has a ring that you can identify, because if there was a year of drought, it's going to be a very thin ring. If there was a lot of rain, it'll be thicker. If there was a fire, you'll see the burn. If there was strong winds, you'll see the impact. The rings not only tell you the age, they tell you the story of the ecosystem, of the forest, of all kinds of interesting things about the planet as well, like the environment, the temperature, climate. It's really cool stuff. So if you go back to back to back to back, you could put together a history of the forest that can go back many thousands of years, which is really cool. So this is a whole field of study, but this is how you know how old a tree is. Now, the oldest trees, the aspen pines, the oldest trees in the world, let me introduce you to a few of them, and then we'll tell you who the oldest ones are. First of all, Prometheus. He was cut off in the year 18 something like that. So how old is he today? Today, well, he's a little over, he's 4,900 years old, right? Did I get that right? Yeah. Prometheus is named after the Greek mythology of Prometheus, the Titan who stole the fire from Mount Olympus and brought it to the humans, and then Zeus punished him by tying him to the mountains and having the vultures eat him up. So, yay, we love Zeus. The second one is named Methuselah, who is also very old. And there's a third one that was only recently discovered that's older than both of them, and its location is kept a secret. But where is Methuselah? Where is Methuselah? So there's a trail here, which is called the Methuselah Trail. And somewhere along this trail, hiding somewhere, who knows where, is Methuselah. How old is Methuselah? Anybody want to guess how old an old tree is?
4,500 years old.
That is very specific. It's older, but that's a very good, you're very close. It's in that neighborhood. It's in the 4,000 or 5,000 year old neighborhood. Okay? Yeah, go ahead.
3,000.
No, it's more than 4,000.
5,000.
Well, it's in between 5 and 6. Between 5 and 6. That's an amazing thing, okay? So we'll look around it here. So what I want to show you is, first of all, there's 5,600. That's very specific. Like, you're a few numbers off, but you'll see how old it is in a few moments. I'm going to share with you. But Yaakov Posner said 5,600. You're off by just a few years. Like, you can count them on one hand, if I remember correctly. So the oldest tree award goes to. We have, and in the third place, Methuselah, who is 4,853 years old. In the second place, though dead, has never been challenged for the second place, 4,900 years old, Prometheus. And in the first place, the still unnamed tree, 5,066 years old. Whoa. That is so old that when the pyramids were built, they had to bring it a birthday gift saying, wow, happy 1000th birthday, depending which pyramid. They're older than the pyramids and they're still alive. That's an amazing thing. Okay? So these are the oldest, tallest, largest, most incredible trees in the world. Now, here's where I have a surprise for you before we get to a night in the museum. There's a place in Utah which has it's called the Pando aspen tree,